Operation Domination is underway. The ultimate game plan to dominate your NFL experience. With your hosts, Dan
You gotta be confident about your Achilles when you
Chase
show up.
Thornton,
Yeah, I mean, I got it.
and Adam LaRue. Don't hope to be great and dominate.
Welcome to Operation Domination. And I think for the first time, I can truly say it is time for 2026 season content. With the Super Bowl over, we're diving right in and kicking it off into getting you prepared for the 2026 season. Love fantasy football. It's all year round. As always, I'm your host, Dan Mater, joined here with Adam LaRue, Chase Thornton. Make sure you're downloading Operation Domination throughout the entire offseason. Going to be nonstop NFL draft content, free agent content, strategy draft content, just like crazy amounts coming to you all season long. And make sure you check out our video content when you go to the Fantasy Football Advice Network YouTube channel at FF Advice Net. All right, gentlemen, it's a jam-packed episode, so I'm going to get right into it. I want to lead this off. And the title of the show, of course, is The Coaching Changes, Fantasy Impact, which is not a unique episode. I realize this. A lot of other podcasts cover this content, especially this time of year after the Super Bowl's over and all the coaching positions, or the main ones at least, have essentially been filled. But here's what has always kind of driven me a little bit crazy about the people who do this content. They'll talk about the coaching changes. They'll talk about what players they think are impacted the most. But in the same breath, will tell you that schematics and coaches are negligent when it comes to fantasy football impact. And it's always been an oxymoron situation to me. So I did a little bit of data digging, and I want to see what your guys' reaction is to this. So basically, I took the last 10 years, and I put together not EPA per offense, not DVOA, but what we actually care about from a fantasy football standpoint. The fantasy points scored per team per game since 2016 all the way up until 2025. To see it, because essentially what I'm looking for is, does the quality of offense, which reflects the play caller's ability, does that have a correlation to fantasy football points or not? Here's what I found. The answer is yes, but more so for different positions. So first, let me start off with the top offenses. And I broke these down into 4 different, we can say it's tiers. I did quartiles. Well, Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. 1 being elite, 2 being above average, 3 being below average, and 4 being poor. Basically, if you're an elite fantasy football offense, you're putting up about 78 fantasy football points per game. And I should preface this by saying that each year was a little bit different as far as where the threshold actually was. This is the 10-year average for these thresholds. For our quarter 2 offenses, somewhere between 72 and 77.9 points per game. Quarter 3 would be 66 to 71.9. Quarter 4 will be 66. So when I reference Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, hopefully you guys, as the listeners and the viewers, will be able to follow along as to what really we're talking about here. Now, here's what I found. A Q1 offense is obviously very, very good for fantasy football purposes because it's spreading all the fantasy football points around. Multiple players on the same team have the ability to be fantasy weekly starters. And ultimately, this is what I was trying to measure it against. In particular for wide receivers. So overall, a poor offense to a great offense, a Q1 to a Q4 offense, doesn't have much of an effect on the wide receiver 1. But it does, however, have a great effect on whether or not that team can sustain multiple fantasy weekly starting wide receivers. The example I gave in here was the Los Angeles Rams this past year, which we saw Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams in a quarter 1 tier offense because the Rams were averaging 95.42 team fantasy points per game. Both of them were weekly fantasy starters and great ones at that. On the flip side, we had the Atlanta Falcons, who were a quarter 3 tier offense. We had Drake London, 13.99 fantasy points per game, very weekly fantasy startable. But then their second receiver, Darnell Mooney, was 4.42 points. But outside of that, it doesn't really affect the wide receiver 1 very much. The other position that the quality of offense and play calling least affected was the running back position. Only about a 36% lift to the running back position get depending upon the quality of the offense. The big divider would be a higher tier offense gave the running back more ability to score touchdowns. That wound up being the difference maker between an elite RB1 and RB2. But ultimately, if you're a running back getting a certain amount of volume, no matter how bad the offense is, you can still be a weekly fantasy starter. Now we get into the positions that it helped the most. Quarterback was number one. The quality of offense dramatically affects the fantasy football ceiling to floor ratio of a quarterback. And we're talking about the difference between a quarter one offense and a quarter four offense can be 9 points per game for fantasy. About an 84% lift. A great example of that would be Caleb Williams. 2024, Shane Waldron. It was a quarter four tier offense. He only averaged 15.56 fantasy points per game. Not startable at all, especially in one quarterback leagues. Fast forward to Ben Johnson, which, believe it or not, was only a quarter two offense. It was not a quarter one offense. It was a quarter two offense. It was 3 extra fantasy points per game at 18.56. Good enough to be a weekly fantasy starter. The quality of offense greatly boosted Caleb Williams and his efficiency. And then tight end was a second. So tight end actually got a 51% lift depending upon the quality of offense. And I actually used Trey McBride and Brock Bowers as the example here. Remember, Brock Bowers' consensus was the tight end one being drafted, but he was in a quarter four offense. And while ultimately 11.86 fantasy points per game is good for a tight end, it's only because he himself is an elite player. And much like the running backs, the quality of offense dictates how many touchdowns a tight end has the ceiling of. Trey McBride in a quarter two offense this past year, 14.88 fantasy points per game and 11 touchdowns. Neither one had great quarterbacks, but the quality of offense for Arizona, I'll grant you, different circumstances, and the quality of offense for the Raiders dictated the ceiling, the floor ratio here. So I know it's a lot to digest. I want to get your guys' reactions. We'll start with Adam. When you hear all those numbers and the quality of offense and the play callers and how they affect it, what's your takeaway on how much that impacts fantasy football?
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, I think it's kind of crazy to come away with the hypothesis that coaching doesn't matter after what we've watched the past few seasons. And I think actually this season's Super Bowl, like we talked about it a little bit off air last week, but this Super Bowl was such a great example of how much coaching does matter in the NFL, because I think we all agreed these weren't the best two teams on paper in the NFL, especially the Patriots. But even Seattle, I don't think is the first or second best roster. But when combined with a coach like Mike Macdonald and their Clint Kubiak obviously getting a head coaching opportunity, clearly that changes, the math a little bit. So clearly coaching matters. And I think that that's both real football and, of course, for this conversation, fantasy. So I think for people to come away with the idea that coaching wouldn't impact things is silly, especially I think tight end being one that it matters a lot makes a ton of sense, because some coaches use tight ends and some don't in the passing game. Like that, again, seems like something that should be clear and should be a safe hypothesis, but a lot of people wouldn't come to that conclusion. So I'm glad that you pulled the data for it, because this is really interesting.
Well, and Chase, I'm going to ask you this question. The reason why a lot of people out there will say that this does not matter is because, well, the personnel will dictate the scheme and will dictate the play calling, and therefore, and yet time and time again, I feel like that doesn't actually wind up happening. Even if you have an elite player, if he's an elite player in a position, Brock Bowers was the greatest example, right? Because we had a long history of Chip Kelly not properly utilizing the number one tight end on his team. And even though you had Brock Bowers, you think would change that, he still had his ceiling limited even on a points per game basis, because it wasn't what he typically does. So it does matter, because coaches do get in their way. I don't know. Chase, what's your take there?
Well, no, I think that for tight end and for running back, what you've done here and what you've kind of laid out for people, I think it kind of reinforces what we all kind of intuitively always felt in terms of the idea of, for the most part, the volume is going to dictate how much a running back can and can't score. Yes, the quality of the offense means they're getting into the red zone more often, which means typically more, touchdown opportunities for those two touchdown dependent, or in tight ends, they're touchdown dependent for those two positions, because both of those positions tend to score their touchdowns from in close. When it comes to quarterbacks and evaluating your quarterbacks, I wonder a little bit about correlation and causation. You know what I mean? Are these quarter one offenses because they have a quarter one type quarterback, or does the quarter one type quarterback create these quarter one offenses? But I really like the idea of applying this to your wide receiver evaluations when you're looking at things, because we dealt with it a lot this year when we talked about the Dallas Cowboys, and hey, how are CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens going to coexist? There's two guys that we've seen be, alpha types in the fantasy realm. And it made me think of like 2020-ish Atlanta Falcons with Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley. And then when Calvin Ridley moved on, was he really an alpha? I really like the implications of taking that kind of research and then applying it to changes in personnel, or if a guy's in a new position, if a guy, like I said, a wide receiver switches teams. Okay. Can his new team reliably absorb him into its offense? Or is this going to be a case where you draft the name and you ignore the situation? So we've talked about it before about location. The location in terms of its correlation to the coaching staff and how they are going to call the offense. Yeah, it's a much bigger deal than a lot of people want to make it out to be.
To your point, you made an excellent point, by the way, but the causation. Yes, typically speaking, a quarter two or a quarter one offense, an elite or above average offense, is going to have probably a pretty good quarterback. It's hard to do one without the other in most cases. Not every case, but in most cases. One of the cases we're going to talk about later on in this show is the Buffalo Bills. We'll get to that, but that's a great point as far as, is it the play caller or is it this guy? But more importantly, the quality of offense, how it affects fantasy-wise the rest of that team, is mostly what we focus in here on, and exactly what the patterns of these new coaches have been and what they've brought to the table. So let's get the ball rolling, shall we? The Falcons, they made new hirings. They brought in Kevin Stefanski. I mean, it's a whole new coaching staff besides Jeff Ulbrich, right? They brought in Kevin Stefanski to be the head coach, Tommy Rees to be the offensive coordinator. The idea as of now is that Tommy Rees is going to be the play caller, but we know that even back with the Browns, this is still Stefanski's offense as a whole. Rees came up with Stefanski, so while he might have his own twist on the play calls themselves, this is essentially Stefanski's offense. And we have a good history of Stefanski, right? Offensive play caller of Minnesota in 2019. That was actually an above average quarter two offense. Then we have him from Cleveland from 2020 to 2024. And then 2025, I kind of gave the credit over to Tommy Rees. So I wanted to focus in on Stefanski a little bit. Basically, in his 4 years at Cleveland, he was either a quarter two, a quarter three, or a quarter four offense. So we had the whole realm. Now, some of that is not entirely his fault, because the quarterback play decreased in his time in Cleveland too. So this is a big factor there. But here's what stuck out to me when I'm looking at Stefanski and what he actually did for each one of the positions. He was over the league average in running back carries, 27 to 24. He was over the league average in running back target share, 20.8% to 17.2% of the league average. So ultimately, right off the rip, that tells me, Bijan Robinson, not that we were worried about you. It looks like you're going to be just fine within the system. It'll feature you. The other caveat I have here is the wide receiver one target share. 25% of the team targets usually go to the wide receiver one. That is elite wide receiver one type of numbers that he's leaving room for. The other receivers on the team combine for 33%. So he is funneling it typically to that number one wide receiver, not much else outside of that. And then the tight ends is the big one. He's over the league average in every category that matters for a tight end. Tight end target share, 27% to the league average of 20. That's a huge gap. Nearly 2 more fantasy football points per game. Nearly 2 more touchdowns per year. So featuring that, this is, I think it does show up what's going to be, but Let's say Kyle Pitts comes back to the Falcons. They have Drake London. They have Bijan Robinson. You're looking at Kevin Stefanski come from Cleveland, which was a bad offense in quarter 4. Adam, does any of this worry you about what we care about fantasy-wise in Atlanta?
Not especially in this case, because I think in the case of Cleveland, it's very circumstantial. I like the data that you've brought forth. I just think that this is a bit of an exceptional case where the personnel in Cleveland was the culprit to me in this example. And furthermore, I also think that was the case, or I think the coaching was the case in Atlanta. I think coaching was the problem for Atlanta. I think personnel was the problem for Cleveland. So I'm optimistic that this could work. I don't think it's a surefire thing, but certainly, and I've never been a big Tommy Rees guy, to be clear, but for the head coaching spot, I really think Stefanski is a pretty big upgrade offensively from what they've had, and certainly won't be giving the tells that Atlanta had been giving each of the last 2 seasons. Zach Robinson, it was pretty clear, even if you were a casual fan, you could just turn on and see exactly what they were going to run before they were going to run. It didn't take a Tony Romo. You could do it yourself and just know based on if they were in shotgun. All right, cool. They're passing. They don't run out of shotgun ever. And all right, they're under center. Cool. They don't pass from under center. So they're going to run. Sweet. Thank you. And you know, there's a basic quality of coaching that I think we need to pass to hit this, for this to be relevant. And I don't think that Atlanta was passing it.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with that too. And just Chase, you, there's a whole quarterback question, right? When is Michael Penix going to be healthy? Who's going to be there in case he's not healthy week 1? How much do we, fantasy-wise, does Stefanski actually boost Michael Penix? We've only seen one quarterback really be successful, and it wouldn't last very long. So what's your take there on that standpoint?
Yeah, I think what you just said is the entire question with this Atlanta offense, and that's the only thing that will govern, for better or for worse, my optimism about this Atlanta offense. Listen, nobody can argue that, yeah, Bijan Robinson is a top tier running back in every way, shape, or form, whether we're talking on the real field or on the fantasy field. And the numbers you laid out, yeah, Bijan to the moon, especially if Tyler Algier moves on like I think he will. But really, it boils down to, we've heard that they're getting rid of Kirk Cousins, and so it's going to be Michael Penix's show, provided he's healthy. What do you feel about Michael Penix, and how do you feel he can perform? Because we know that, to go back to our previous discussion about coaching environments reflecting, in the fantasy points, when Kevin Stefanski has had a capable, competent quarterback, he has led quartile 2 and up type offenses, which would then bode well for, say, whoever ends up being the wide receiver 2 there. Winds up being good news for Drake London in terms of him maintaining his status as one of the top, wide receivers in the league for fantasy. So it all boils down to, what do you think of their quarterback? Because if you think that Michael Penix can be even a competent quarterback, Stefanski has an offensive history of being able to lead very, very fantasy-friendly offenses, regardless of position. And I agree with you that, yeah, if Kyle Pitts comes back, there's some nice numbers there, but Kyle Pitts needs to come back. So from a fantasy standpoint, Atlanta, I think, is one of the more interesting locations to follow this offseason because of all of the moving parts that could fall together absolutely perfectly for what we do, regardless of how it works out in the standings for the Falcons.
I think the nice thing about all this is that we like predictability. And with the Atlanta Falcons, what I can say is predictable is that the positions we care about, Bijan, Drake, if Kyle Pitts returns, I'm not worried about it under Kevin Stefanski. That's ultimately the takeaway that I have there. This team, I have a little bit of a different take on as far as my worriedness. So the Miami Dolphins, they have now Jeff Hafley as the head coach, and they brought in Bobby Slowick. And then literally earlier today, they brought in Kevin Patullo to be their pass game coordinator. which means this is going to be very uncreative and static and not very good, at least in my opinion. But let's look at some of the data. So Bobby Slowick under Houston in CJ Stroud's rookie year did manage to put together an above average offense. They averaged 77.12 half-point PPR points per game as a team. That was above the league average and put them in the quarter two conversation. That was the only year that we saw a quarterback actually flourish from a fantasy standpoint under Bobby Slowick. Now, what he had 2023 and he had 2024. 2024, he got fired because the way the offense took a step backwards. It took a step backwards, and it was really a quarter three offense, a below average offense from that standpoint. The only position that survived consistency fantasy output for Bobby Slowick in both years was the wide receiver position as a whole. Both years, because he did not emphasize wide receiver elite one level target share to any one particular receiver. Even when he had a quarter three offense, they actually had multiple receivers that were still fantasy relevant in 2024. Think Stephon Diggs, Tank Dell, and Nico Collins and all those guys. That's also what it dribbled down to. Remember Nico Collins in 2023, the reason why he was a wide receiver one was because the incredible efficiency that he was having. He wasn't overly volume targeted. So I'm going to lead off with this going into the Dolphins. I'll kick it right back to Chase here. Because when I think of the Dolphins right now, I think of two players. I think of Devon Achane, I think of Jalen Waddle. Because the rest of it is up for grabs as far as what it's even going to look like. So knowing that Bobby Slowick will funnel the majority of his team targets to the wide receivers, which was a 7.8% increase over the league average both years, how does that make you feel about Jalen Waddle under Bobby Slowick, even if, I don't know, maybe he's not the most creative guy or not super excited about it?
No, I don't mind the idea of Jalen Waddle. Jalen Waddle's somebody that we always have looked at like he's got the tools to be that number one type of guy if he could ever just be in the right situation. But it seems like the right situation was always eluding him because he had to deal with the Tyreek Hill situation. Again, I really wish I knew what was going to happen with their quarterback situation, whether it's going to be Malik Willis, whether it's going to be Tua, whether it's going to be, Quinn Ewers. If it's Quinn Ewers, I know what I think of everybody, but I digress. I'm less worried. Let me put it this way. I'm honestly less worried about Jalen Waddle than I am about what they're going to do with Devon Achane and if they're going to continue to kind of get him the football through the air, or is he going to be strictly? Remember, Slowick didn't have a great running back core. Now, he didn't have a Devon Achane type running back when he was in Houston there. He mixed it up. He had Mixon for part of a year. He had Singletary. He had Dario Gumbawala, who's a wonderful human being, but not a fantasy asset. See, even the dog agrees. So I'm less worried about Jaden Waddle because I think that Tyreek Hill is done in Miami. So I think that Waddle is going to take over and be the number one guy. And as a number one receiver, I think that he can flourish in a Bobby Slowick type offense to some extent, regardless of who's throwing him the football. But man, having that quarterback situation hashed out would really help me feel better about things.
Well, it's that, and also, are they going to add, too many more pieces? Again, we saw with Slowick, if they added 2-3 weapons, he would not feature number one receiver. What I'm interested in to see if that changes, if Waddle's really the only prominent receiver that you actually have available to you. To your point about Devon Achane, here's what is interesting. While he didn't have a great running back in Houston, he was exposed to Christian McCaffrey when he was with the 49ers back in 2023 or 2022 before he left to go be the offensive coordinator for Houston. So, and when I look at this, quality of talent definitely matters, but the volume overall for the running back position was well below league average in both target share and carries. So, Adam, when I go to you, and from, I remember those Houston days, it wasn't the most creative thing of getting the running backs involved to begin with either. It wasn't like he was trying to establish that consistently. So is anything about that worry you about Devon Achane? Let's say his ceiling. We know he's too good of a player to not be fantasy relevant week in and week out, but maybe his ceiling.
Yeah, I'm really curious in general how much he learned from Mike McDaniel. In terms of one, just creativity in general, but two, just like, for example, he threw play action in the last season with CJ Stroud. I think it was 26% of the time. versus last season in Miami, under Mike McDaniel, it was 33% or 32.4%. And in terms of zone and gap schemes, it was fairly varied with Mike McDaniel. I mean, we know him as a zone guy, but it was, I think, 59% of the rush attempts for Miami were in zone. And he was, Slowick, last time he was in Houston, was way up in the 60s. Like, I think 67%. Like, to your point, like, just to put these numbers out there, it was not creative. It was very similar to what I just talked about with Zach Robinson. It was very predictable, like snap in and snap out what they were going to do. And while the offense was not necessarily incredibly successful under Mike McDaniel, that wasn't the case as much. He was coaching. There was an attempt to disguise things, an attempt to be multiple, an attempt to do different things out of the same formation. And if he learned to do that, this can be a successful offense. Not great, but successful to some degree. But if he just runs back and does what he did in 2024 with, candidly, a similar, if not worse situation, it's not going to be pretty.
I'm with you. There's a lot of holes Miami's got to fill. I mean, besides the quarterback situation, their offensive line is god awful. Like, and the defensively, Jeff Hafley is going to be having to change the personnel because that defense was not set up to be a 4-3. So you're going to have to change. There's a lot of flux that's going to be going on with the Miami Dolphins, and they don't have a ton of cap room. They have a normal amount of picks. Like, so this is going to be an interesting little reset here going on with Miami. To that point, I'm predicting a 3 offense, a below average offense, which means the wide receiver 1 can survive and running back 1 can survive, but their ceilings are cut and they're fantasy weekly starters as a result. And that's kind of what the data is telling me here.
So everybody that got excited about Greg Dulcich and how he finished the season and looked like he might actually be what everybody drafted him to be in Dynasty 3-4 years ago. Yeah, he's going to continue to be the same thing that 3/4 of the tight ends in the league are, just a complete and total shot in the dark.
Yeah, because that's the position I didn't even mention with Bobby Slowick, but that's been well below average.
Yes,
every time he's been a play caller with their usage and fantasy points per game. All right, so the next team, I told you we're going to talk about these guys, and we don't spend a lot of time on it because there's not a big change here ultimately, right? Joe Brady takes on head coach. He already was the play caller the last 2 years. We kind of know what we're going to expect. I don't expect that they're going to change up the offense much. And then this is where we can get to the causation. I want to kick it back to Chase to just talk a little bit about the causation here with the Buffalo Bills, because they were a Q1 elite offense from a fantasy points per game standpoint, both 2024 and 2025. The quarterback position in particular, scoring 6 more points per game than the league average quarterback 1 in Josh Allen, yet only dropping back about 2 less times per game than the league average. Ultimately saying Josh Allen as a runner is what made this fantasy engine essentially go. That and James Cook, I'll talk about that in a second. But when you look at that for Buffalo, knowing how Joe Brady's called this game as a super spreader offense, how do you see this thing?
Yeah, like you said, I don't see a ton of difference in terms of how they, continue to operate in terms of their percentages, run percentages, things like that on offense. But yeah, you talk about the fantasy points they scored per game, and 44% of them came from the QB1 in points per game and the running back 6. Any team that can have those two is gonna score a ton of fantasy points. There are still fantasy points to be had in that offense, but with it being the super spreader offense and with them not having an obvious candidate for a number 1 receiver, this is still going to be an offense that I want a piece of them. I love having Josh Allen if you want to take the high enough draft pick to get him. I love having James Cook if you want to spend the high enough draft pick to get him. And I feel like you have to have a piece of it somewhere, but I don't want to have necessarily any of their pass catchers because they're going to spread it around. What it does mean is that if he's healthy, Dalton Kincaid as the tight end is a little less touchdown dependent than other tight ends, or should be a less touchdown dependent than other tight ends. So I think you can feel confident going back to the well with that. I'm still steering clear of the wide receivers in this offense, even though there's room and should be room for 2 top performers at wide receiver until and unless they can get a guy in the door who fits that profile. Until then, it's just going to be, he'll throw it to whoever's healthy. And in the meantime, you can always count on points from Josh Allen and James Cook.
Well, because apparently it was Sean McDermott's fault that they got Keon Coleman, which makes no sense to me still to this day.
I'm still cringing over that.
Head coach had nothing to do with them picking a wide receiver in the second round. I'm going to tell you that right now. Regardless. Now, you mentioned something that was interesting. The tight ends, you think they could eat? Well, the fact of the matter is over the last 2 years, the tight ends have been below average in both tight end target share and tight end fantasy points per game for Buffalo under Joe Brady. Which makes no sense because since they haven't had a lot of talent since Stephon Diggs left the wide receiver position, their biggest talent was supposed to be their first round draft pick in Dalton Kincaid, and yet they don't utilize them. It's a super spreader offense through and through. Here's what proves it. The wide receiver 1 target share for Buffalo average over the last 2 years is just over 18%. The league average is over 22%. But the target share for their other wide receivers that aren't the quote-unquote wide receiver 1 of the team is over 42%. The league average for other wide receivers is 36%. It shows you proofs in the pudding where he has set this up. This is a super spreader offense where we run the ball with our quarterback, we run the ball with our running back, because even the running back target share is below average. So, Adam, I ask you this. Everyone keeps harping on Buffalo. Get a wide receiver. Get a wide receiver. They just need an alpha wide receiver to take it to the next level. If they do that, given Joe Brady's history, and by the way, it's not just Buffalo. This goes back to Carolina, goes back to LSU, even though you had juggernauts in LSU. It's a little bit of a different story, but he's a super spreader guy. That's who he's always been. They get a mega wide receiver. How much does that change things in your mind?
Probably not much, to be honest with you. I just don't think that this is a team that is and their offensive room is set up to have like the typical guy that's moving around the formation, and you're making the one guy the weapon, but he can attack you from all these different spots. I think that they like to have players in their roles and not move them around, not let them be varied, not let receivers necessarily be versatile. And I think what reinforces that to me is that you go out and you add Pete Carmichael to the room, which New Orleans and Denver, much the same, candidly, where not guys where you're moving your receivers out a ton and like trying to let them be versatile. I mean, to be at least a little bit fair, Pete Carmichael was there for Michael Thomas, where they did that a little bit, but nonetheless, he was just a slot receiver that ate, more or less, not necessarily a guy who was moving around the formation a whole ton, like you see with the your CeeDee Lambs, your Jamar Chases, your Justin Jefferson. So I don't know that they're set up to be a team that can really house that level of wide receiver. Maybe it gets better if like their identity changes from a personnel standpoint, but that's the only help that can really come. I don't think coaching is changing in any significant way.
But do you not think that if they had that alpha type guy, because I think we all agree there has not been an alpha type guy there in a couple of years. If he had that alpha type guy, do you think that Josh Allen wouldn't go to him regardless of what the play call and reads are? Your reads can be whatever they are, but if a guy's good enough that he's getting open, that's the guy you're going to be throwing to more often than not. And 2023, I realize different coaching staff and everything else, but 2023, he did throw the ball to Stephon Diggs 160 times. It's not like he won't target a guy who's good. And Stephon Diggs, recent, troubles aside, is we have all acknowledged has been that alpha type guy over the course of his career at times. So I don't think that he wouldn't that Josh Allen, who actually ultimately has the control over where he's throwing the football, I don't think that he wouldn't target a guy who was an alpha type, even with the offense being set up as it is to offer different guys opportunities. If they got a guy in the door, I would be all over that dude.
Here's where I agree with you. Josh Allen is desperate for a go-to option and a safety blanket.
Yeah.
And if he got that option, I 100% agree with you. He would go to that option very frequently, despite the play calling. My point, I guess, is more this. I don't know if the Bills are going to ever bother with Joe Brady, the way he runs this system, because they have been an elite level offense. The 2 years he's been there doing what they do, which is why I think the Sean McDermott firing was even more hilarious, because ultimately it's the defense that's the issue. I don't think Joe Brady's the one who's going to fix that. You got to hope your defensive coordinator you hired in Jim Leonard is going to be the one who fixes that. I mean, I do think there's ultimately an issue where they need more weaponry to take it to a level they could possibly go to. That's 100%. But I guess my point more so being is that I don't think Joe Burry believes in bringing in an alpha type of guy. I mean, he might believe in trying to bring in 2 upgrades, which goes back to his spreader theory. But ultimately, this is who he kind of wants to be. So that's why I don't know who else they're going to add. And plus, between free agency and where they're going to select in the draft, there's no guarantee there's an alpha type of wide receiver weapon that's going to even make their way to Buffalo.
Yeah, no, it would take a major move that I agree with you. I don't think that they have in them. I don't think they have the desire to make that kind of a move, especially after that crazy ass press conference we all saw a couple weeks ago.
So it's just one of those things. We'll have to see how that changes. That's something where a player of certain talent could change the scheme and play calling to at least some degree, or Josh Allen saying the hell with it, I'm going to do what I need to do. Let's go to the Giants. Oh, the Giants. You did so good with hiring John Harbaugh to turn around the organization. You screwed it all up with hiring Matt Nagy as the offensive coordinator. Just a way to find a way to screw the whole thing up. So they do bring in Matt Nagy. He's who we're going to focus on because the offense is a fantasy football show. I look back at his time in Chicago because I don't really care what he did in Kansas City. Andy Reid's the one sitting there calling the plays, and he got Patrick Mahomes. So what did you do in Chicago when the whole thing was yours? Well, ultimately, he either had an above-average offense or he had a very poor offense. There was no in between. It was one or the other. Ultimately, his 4 years, his average came in, we'll call it the average threshold because he's at the top end of the below average offense and right below the above average offense with 71.34 team fantasy points per game. The league average in those same years, though, by the way, was 78. So he comes in just in the key threshold of our 10-year data, but for those particular years was well below average in team fantasy points per game given. Those are also the Mitchell Trubisky years. If we all ultimately remember those years and how wonky and crazy that they could be. Basically, it went like this. Every single position was below average from the league average for fantasy football purposes. Quarterback, 15.61 to 17.96. Running back, 13.05 to 13.49. Wide receiver 1, 11.62 to 12.11. And tight end 1, 5.85 to 7.08. You're going to a Giants team that has Jackson Dart. You hope Cam Scatterbo is back. You hope Malik Neighbors is back from returning from ACL. There's players we care about on this team. Adam, what's your take here at Matt Nagy?
It's not good. I think more than that, to be a little bit, more descriptive, it's not inspiring for the whole operation top to bottom. I think, Harbaugh has been at the same place for so long. You hope that getting fired or whatever, that you end up letting that be some kind of inspiration to do things a little bit differently. And Nagy is a guy who is just right in line. You may as well have gotten any of your normal cast of characters at OC. Maybe that's even giving Nagy a little bit of credit, to be honest with you. But it's just, this makes sense for Harbaugh. But it's bad for the New York Giants. I think this is a team where they're walking a tightrope where I think with really good coaching, they could be something. But I think you need to pull things out of Jackson Dart as a passer because he's not there yet. And I don't think that this is going to be the staff to do it, to be honest with you. I think that they'll be fine in terms of getting him out of the pocket and letting the QB run stuff. So for fantasy perspective, short term, maybe he's all right. I think the run game will be okay, not great, but okay. I mean, it'll go at least as far as this Scatterbo's health will allow it to. But in terms of the development of your quarterback, which is ultimately what's going to carry this offense wherever it goes long term, I don't think that this is a positive hire.
Now, the only thing I could even see here, and by the way, I just want to put this out there. During the draft process, Jackson Dart was already in a comparable zone for me to Mitchell Trubisky to begin with. So this is not a good thing that we're going to now pair him up with the coach who made sure he got run into a permanent backup role, in my opinion. He can run.
Hey. Mitchell Trubisky was a Pro Bowl quarterback in 2018 under Matt
George
Nagy.
Sanders. So what does that matter at all? Yeah, do not care. But it can run a little bit, can throw the ball over the middle. I question his ability to read. I question his ability to consistently throw the outside. I mean, it's the same guy ultimately. What we're talking about here. He did have a year where he was able to put it together. To your point, the Pro Bowl year, Trubisky was a top 12 quarterback, but usually not sustained success is mostly the issue. The only thing I'm looking at here that would give me some hope as far as how the Giants line this thing up. Well, two things, actually. The target share for the wide receiver 1 was nearly 25%, and the target share for the running back was over the league average. Is that enough to save Neighbors and Scatabo with where they're probably going to be ADP'd at to be in drafts next season, Chase? Because figure Malik Neighbors, we're probably still talking second, third round, even though he's coming off the ACL because he's a younger player. Cam Scatabo, I'm going to assume, just off the top of my head, probably somewhere between the 4th and 6th rounds, maybe higher because people really loved what they saw out of him. So if you're talking about that kind of draft capital with this coaching scheme now, where are you at with that?
I'm not worried about Malik Neighbors talent-wise. And I mean, remember that a Matt Nagy offense had Allen Robinson as a top 12 fantasy option. So, and I think that Malik Neighbors is infinitely more talented than Allen Robinson. I'll say that all day long. With Neighbors, it's going to come down, ultimately to his health. I don't know that I'll be in on him necessarily at the price I'll have to pay for him on draft day, but I'm not worried about him from a production standpoint in this type of an offense. We kind of, joked around about the idea of Mitch Trubisky being a Pro Bowl quarterback here, but I think that Nagy can get at least Mitchell Trubisky numbers. I think he should be able to get better than Mitchell Trubisky numbers out of Jackson Dart, because ultimately I honestly do think Jackson Dart is more physically talented than Mitchell Trubisky. David Montgomery was a top 10 type option at times under Matt Nagy. Cam Scatabo, I don't personally have as high of an opinion of Cam Scatabo as I did of David Montgomery. So I'm not necessarily expecting as much there, but I think that there is juice to be had there for the likes of their primary offensive skill position players. But like you said, they were quarter 2, quarter 4, quarter 2. They were kind of back and forth, and it was kind of up and down as to how Nagy's offenses have performed as a whole. And so for that reason, I'm going to assume that quartile 2 is a ceiling. And because that's the case, it makes me, it just further reinforces my idea that I don't want anything to do with the number 2 receiver on this team. I don't necessarily want anything to do with, even though I love Theo Johnson as a player, I don't necessarily want a whole lot to do with him as a tight end unless I'm late in a draft and I don't have one yet. And then he's as good a dart throw as any. But like we just said, it's a dart throw. You can't narrow anything down from that. Scatabo, I think, will perform well, but I'm not expecting top 10, top 12 type numbers from a Cam Scatabo in this offense.
I was just going to say, the one thing I give Theo Johnson some hope for is that Dart pegs that middle of the field so often. He likes to peg the big guy over the middle of the field.
Yes.
And maybe he can survive off of Dart, not necessarily the scheme and the play call of Matt Nagy, which is funny to me because Nagy comes to the Chiefs. They come from a team where they featured the hell out of Travis Kelce. Didn't do it in Chicago. Yep. Didn't bother doing it in Chicago. So we'll see exactly how that plays out there. All right, so this next one, you want to talk about another situation of correlation versus causation. Mike McCarthy taking over the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, ultimately speaking, when you look at Mike McCarthy's recent history dating back to 2016, I didn't bother going back any further than that because at that point, I feel like it's irrelevant. But going back to 2016, for the most part, he's either had an above average or an elite offense, except for 2 seasons. 2017 with the Green Bay Packers, it was a below average offense, a Q3. And 2024 with the Dallas Cowboys, below average offense, it was a Q3. You know what those 2 seasons had in common? His quarterbacks got hurt. Aaron Rodgers was banged up in 2017. Dak Prescott was banged up in 2024. So what this tells me, because we've seen other coaches be in positions where they have to go to their backup quarterback and the offense doesn't miss a beat. What this tells me, he needs a starter who needs to be an above average starter and in place for this offense to produce under McCarthy, because ultimately, when you break down his film play calling, it's not very creative. Hasn't been very creative for years and years and years. The game has passed him by, and he's getting another shot, which is why he probably belongs in Pittsburgh anyway, because they don't believe in real offense. If Rodgers is the quarterback now for the Pittsburgh Steelers, does anything about this, Adam, to you stick out? It's like, hey, you look at, they got Jalen Warren, they have DK Metcalf, Pat Freiermuth will still be there. Like, is anything sticking out to you of like, yeah, I want a piece of that? Let's start with the DK Metcalf of it all. Like, because people are going to be looking at that. Like, can Metcalf bounce back with somebody who's not Arthur Smith back there with Mike McCarthy?
I mean, it depends on what you're looking at for a bounce back. Like a return to his heyday in Seattle. Like, no, that's not happening. But like an uptick in volume, like I think that the Pittsburgh Steelers, I don't really care who the quarterback is going to be honest with you. I think that their pass attempts are going to go up. And I think that he will probably maintain, if not exceed, his target share from last season. So from that perspective, do I think that, he'll have a better season than last season? Yes, I do. But how much better? Like, I don't think he's going to be a wide receiver one. I don't think he's going to sniff that. And even like, it's just like, where are you going to get to? Like, I don't know that he's not someone that excites me, I guess is where I'll boil it down to. I think that if he falls, he could become a value just because of people getting frustrated with him the past couple seasons. Like there's a world where he is a smart person to grab, but he's not someone that I'm going to be going into drafts with like the intent to acquire, or I'm going to be like building rosters around, or I'm going to be waiting on wide receiver because I know that I have this option late. Like he's not someone who's exciting to me in that way, but he is someone who I could see becoming a value.
That is the one position that McCarthy has boosted throughout his play calling career, right? Nearly 26% for that wide receiver one, and still over the league average when it comes to the other wide receivers and their target share, 40% to the league average of about 36. So that's the one position, because tight end, below average. Running back usage, below average. Quarterback's been really good when he's had the guys in his prime and they're healthy and, everything like that's rocking and rolling. So when you look at that, Chase, where do you fall? Let's say we're talking about, a Jalen Warren. Like Ken Gainwell might not be around. You look at that for Jalen Warren. Any chance here that it's a Jalen Warren time that people have been hyping up for forever?
No. So Matthew Berry, among others, used to have a battle cry about, free Aaron Jones, unchain Aaron Jones, let him go. Guess what person was the coach of the Green Bay Packers when that whole battle cry started? It was Mike McCarthy. So if you thought you were frustrated with Jalen Warren this year, because of the presence of Kenneth Gainwell, whether Gainwell comes back or not, you still have an offensive history of being very, very frustrating with a guy who's capable of being a running back one, but is not necessarily going to be allowed the workload to become that running back one. So the McCarthy hire in Pittsburgh, regardless of who the quarterback is, regardless of anything else, really frustrates me if I'm a Jalen Warren dynasty owner, or if I'm somebody who really likes Jalen Warren and was thinking of trying to target him in drafts here coming up, in 6 months. In regards, go ahead.
I was going to say, I have a follow-up to that. We talk about McCarthy. The number one position he boosts is wide receivers, because to Adam's point, everything tells you he will pass more, right? What are the Pittsburgh Steelers going to look like if they're throwing the ball more than they're running? Even if it is Aaron Rodgers back there at this point in his career. What does that even look like? That in itself could be a recipe for disaster. I mean, that's my take on it. What's yours?
It's a recipe for a PR disaster, if nothing else. I mean, Pittsburgh boy coming home and then wanting to play, finesse, football like that. But yeah, I listen. I have a lot of respect for what Coach McCarthy and Aaron Rodgers did here in Green Bay. I'm a little annoyed with other aspects of their, careers up to this point, but this is not an offense right now that I'm overly excited to have any part of. I think even if, DK Metcalf gets a theoretical boost from the idea that he's the number one wide receiver in a Mike McCarthy offense, what are we really boosting from, and how big a boost can it be when it's capped by what Aaron Rodgers is at this point in his career. So I definitely don't want, unfortunately, any part of their tight ends. I don't want any part of their quarterback situation, regardless of who it is, especially if it's Will Howard in year one of his starting career. But I mean, man, Jaylen Warren is going to have to come to me at an awful discount for me to want to consider him on draft day. And the same with DK Metcalf. I'm really going to have to see those guys be a value at where they fall to me at before I consider pulling the trigger on them.
You know who's surprisingly similar to Mike McCarthy as far as his tendencies go for fantasy football standpoint? Brian Daboll. So Robert Saleh, Brian Daboll, they're going to go take over the Tennessee Titans. And ultimately, look, I think this is definitely an improvement of a coaching staff from Callahan. No question about it. But just, again, zooming in here on a fantasy standpoint. So Daboll was the play caller for Buffalo from 2018 to 2021. And during which, 2018, 2019 took his lumps, poor offense. Josh Allen came along. All of a sudden, they became an elite offense 2020 and 2021. And they also had Stephon Diggs a little bit during that time, too. So they had the combination going on there. I stop at the Giants at 2022, which was a below-average offense, the quarter three offense. The reason I stop at 2022 is because the years after that, there was a lot of Daboll calling plays, then he gives it to the offensive coordinator, takes it back from the offensive coordinator, gives it back to the offensive coordinator, and there was a lot of that going on for the last few years, like over that. So I'm not even diving into that. I'm just going to stick with the years where we know it was Daboll as the play caller pretty much the entire year. During this time, very similar, like I said, to Mike McCarthy, below average usage for the running back, below average usage, way below average usage for the tight end. Quarterback with Josh Allen was fine. Higher dropbacks for Daboll. A little bit over the average, with even with Josh Allen, was over the average with dropbacks. The big thing we harped in on is, again, he boosts the wide receivers. Over 26% target share for that wide receiver one, and over 41% for the other wide receivers. His offense funnels to those wide receivers. So when we look at the context of Tennessee, we know Cam Ward's going to be the quarterback. Running back, Tajay Spears will definitely be there. Tony Pollard might still be there for another year. Calvin Ridley's got anything left? Maybe he's still on the team. They drafted Alik Eomanor. They drafted Chimere Dike. They have Chigo Akonzo or Akawa or whatever his name is on as a tight end. I know I butchered that. My bad.
Love it.
And we also know they have $100 million in cap. We also know they have high draft picks. So this is a team that could definitely look different weaponry-wise once it's heading into the offseason. But as it stands today, Adam, you look at Daboll. We went over his numbers. What's your immediate fantasy impact here?
I'm really, really curious about the running game. So quarterback, I think you laid it out well. I think it'll be fine. I don't think that he's going to be a key in the development for Cam Ward. But what I do think is he can put him in positions to hide his current flaws. I just don't know that he's going to improve upon those flaws kind of in the background, I guess is where I'm going with that. Like, he will maximize what Cam Ward is currently good at. I just don't know that Cam Ward will get much better during the duration of their partnership, so to speak. Running game to me is fascinating because the Tennessee Titans are one of the teams running gap like the most in the NFL last season. They were over 70%. And I think that Daboll has wanted to get into a more power run game and not been able to personnel wise, because he was very clearly at odds with the general manager in New York. But at the same time, he's always been a zone guy wherever he's been, whether he wants to or not. Like, the reality on paper is that they've run zone. So where this goes now, where I think that's fine and where I think that Tony Pollard might come back is that Tony Pollard's done both. So that's fine. But with Spears being a younger guy, like that switch might actually be a problem for him, and already being a guy who's now it's not even this past regime that got him, right? He's a regime before even that. So he's like way past the point that anyone there cares about Tyjae Spears, to be honest with you. So like, I think he's an afterthought. Not necessarily in terms of, carries and whatnot, but in terms of like schematically, I think that they don't care. Like he's going to do what he's going to do, and that's fine. But bringing back someone like Pollard could make a ton of sense. I kind of expect them to do that unless someone more interesting comes up on the market. But I think they'd be afraid to go with Spears as any type of key running back in this situation. Like I wouldn't be looking at, Pollard could go, I'm going to potentially invest in Dynasty and Spears. I don't think it's like that at all. I think that Spears is someone that they will roster because he is cheap to roster and he is nothing more than that. But I'm really interested to see how this running game goes because it's a massive flip. Both like I've been talking about it from the running back perspective, but offensive line wise, like that is a massive change to go from 70% gap to 70% zone. Like that's intense. That's almost as big as what we were just talking about a little bit ago with Halfley in terms of changing their defense. Like personnel wise, it's going to be a weird shakeup for them. And that's going to be tough. So I'm really curious how that whole thing goes, but Cam Ward, I think will be fine. And receiver, it's hard to say because there's nobody who I'd be excited about in Tennessee. You tell me that they add someone and that person could be really interesting because to your point, they've hyper targeted guys and he is a offensive mind that will move receivers around the formation, especially throwing the guys in the slot and in the middle of the field. And I think that Cam Ward can succeed doing that. But there's a lot of question marks here. I guess that's what it really boils down to because there's a lot of changing pieces here. There's a lot of the other positions. There's not a big change in what the previous team did and what this team does. There's big changes for Tennessee.
No, and there's big changes because, like I said, all the resources they have available to them. This could be a very different looking offense. You mentioned the offensive line; it could be a whole new 5 starting offensive line. And there's nobody you're worried about losing here in the same breath. With the Tyjae Spears thing, is interesting because with Spears, like, all right, but we care more about him getting targeted, correct? But then that's where Daboll comes in, especially his error with Buffalo was like 3% below the league average as far as implementing his running backs in the receiving game for running back target share. Is that like a 16.6 and the league average during that time was 19.8. And that even went on to the Giants with Saquon Barkley. He didn't target Saquon a ton either. And we know what Saquon can be as a receiver, although the Eagles don't do it either, but that's a whole other story that we can't get into right now. But so when you're looking at Tennessee with all the flux here, let's focus in on Cam Ward, Chase. I mean, how do you think this affects Cam Ward with knowing Daboll's style of a lot of stuff, 7 yards down the field? He likes to try to get that in rhythm. Is Cam Ward an in rhythm thrower?
I think he can be. I think he should be. Let me say this. Brian Daboll was the coach who was behind my love affair with Daniel Jones as a fantasy asset at quarterback. And then by extension, my love of other reclamation projects, Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield and so on and so forth. Daniel Jones' best fantasy season, he was quarterback 9 in 2022 under Daboll there. And he only threw for 15 touchdowns that season. And he only ran for 7. And he did it with a mishmash of people at wide receiver. He did it with the drying, decaying husk of Kenny Golladay at wide receiver and Isaiah Hodgins and just a complete and total used car salesman, roster at wide receiver and with nothing to speak of at tight end. I am not excited about the idea of Brian Daboll being the head coach in terms of what it means for the running back position in Tennessee. Offensive coordinator, but running the offense either way. I'm not excited about the idea of Brian Daboll running the offense for what it means for the running back position in Tennessee. I'm not excited for the wide receiver position there, regardless of who they may or may not bring in. They do need to add talent to that room, but either way, with Daboll as a coach, that I'm not intrigued there. Chig Okonkwo, I think, is going to continue to frustrate people and just be Chig Okonkwo, a good player, but criminally underused and under fantasy valuable.
They drafted Gunnar Helm last year.
Exactly. But I do like what Brian Daboll could mean for Cam Ward. I think he has me optimistic on Cam Ward. Optimistic to the point, not that I'm going to push him into quarterback one type territory. I don't think Cam Ward is the runner that Daniel Jones is when Daniel Jones is healthy and hasn't blown an Achilles, unfortunately. But I do like the idea of what Brian Daboll could mean for Cam Ward in terms of his development and in terms of becoming a fantasy relevant type quarterback. I think if you're in a 16 team type league, Cam Ward, yeah, I think he pushes for QB1 status. I think if you are in super flex, like we've talked about most of our dynasty leagues are, I would be thrilled having Cam Ward as my QB2 in those kinds of situations, because I think that Daboll is going to be a positive influence for Cam Ward. I'm excited for that. The rest of the offense, knowing how Daboll has typically performed and knowing how players have typically performed under him, I can't get excited about the rest of them unless they bring in somebody that none of us has on our radar right now.
Well, here's what I will say. There's two things I find interesting here. One, I'm kind of with you that I don't think this is a negative for Cam Ward, but I would lay out that the only time Daboll's had success with his quarterback was if it was a Josh Allen runner or Daniel Jones, who had his best rushing career that one year with the Giants. It wasn't necessarily about their throwing. On the flip side of that, if they get an alpha wide receiver who's not on the team right now, I mean, there's a lot of data here that suggests that alpha wide receiver will be something of interest too. So a couple things we'll look out there for Tennessee. Let's move on to Baltimore. So Jesse Minter, who was a defensive coordinator of the Chargers, he takes over as head coach. He brings in Declan Doyle, who was the offensive coordinator of the Bears last year. Of course, under Ben Johnson, wasn't calling a ton of plays. Before he was with Ben Johnson, he was with the Broncos for 2 years as a tight ends coach under Sean Payton. So Sean Payton, Ben Johnson, pretty strong background there as far as guys getting their feet wet as offensive play callers in the making. And before that, he was with Sean Payton even longer because he was with Sean Payton and the Saints too, as an offensive assistant. From what I understand, from people who know him around the league and insiders, they all seem to think pretty highly of what he's going to be as an offensive mind in this league down the road. We don't have much of a sample to go off of. I can talk about those offenses that he's been a part of. The one thing that stands out to me right away is that he's never been part of an offense that was a poor offense, never been in a quarter four offense. So we're talking about, below average to above average to even a couple years of elite, although that was a while ago with Sean Payton. So he does have that going for him. We look at the Ravens, right? Lamar Jackson, can he get back up to snuff? Are you going to let him run the way that you did? Can you afford not to? Because we saw Lamar Jackson look like when he wasn't running the football. Wasn't a very good quarterback, wasn't a very good fantasy football playmaker. You have Derrick Henry, who we care about. Mark Andrews, we know is definitely on the team. We don't know if Isaiah Likely is going to be on the team. Wide receivers, Zay Flowers. So when you mix all that together, given his background, Adam, what's your takeaway? What's your feel for Declan Doyle overall?
I'm cautious about it. We've never seen him call plays, but I'm very optimistic about Declan Doyle. Let me give you what I think, to me, as an observer, is the most exciting. The last 2 years, the offensive Declan Doyle has been a part of, and again, he wasn't, like you mentioned, he wasn't a play caller, and he wasn't the biggest offensive voice in the room, but just what he's been around. These are teams that loved play action. And for Lamar and for what the Baltimore Ravens are, that in and of itself is such a big step in the right direction. Last season, it's such a huge disparity. Last season, and granted, the Ravens did run play action last season 26% of the time. They weren't the bottom of the league by any stretch of the means. Chicago was at 32.5%, and they were at 28.8% in Denver the year prior. And Lamar, in his own right, by the way, his PFF passing grade on the season, and again, we talk about it all the time, it's not the be all end all by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that when it's this big of a disparity that I'm about to give you, it's at least interesting. If you don't like PFF, whatever, that's fine. Just for what it's worth. And NFL passer rating, by the way, tracks fairly well with what I'm about to say too. His passer grade on the season was 69. Nice.
Oof.
On play action, Lamar Jackson was at 88.9. And it tracks very similarly. Every season of his career, his best grade is on play action, both PFF grades and passer rating. By the way, just passer rating. All right, fine. You don't like PFF? Here you go. On play action, Lamar Jackson had a 151.3 NFL passer rating last season. His total was 103.8. He was awesome on play action last season. 10 touchdowns and 1 interception on a season where he was 21-7. So just in and of itself, committing to we're going to run the ball and we're going to throw a lot of play action at you, that is going to be massive for the Baltimore Ravens offense and everyone involved. So for Lamar Jackson and for the running game in general, whether that's continuing to go with Derrick Henry or that's another avenue, I think it's a big win. I don't know how much you're going to get out of the receivers. I don't know that changes much. Maybe it's more big plays. But I think that a return to form for Lamar Jackson specifically, I think is something that I'm extremely optimistic about.
All right. I like that breakdown. Nicely done by you. Chase, what's your take here on the new Declan Doyle play caller?
Well, play action tends to work really, really well when the threat of the play on the action is Derrick Henry. And so I think that's going to play a big, part in things as well. But yeah, if they can get him back, if he can be anything, close to what we think of when we think of King Henry, that will bode very well for Lamar Jackson. I am not as optimistic, however, on Derrick Henry. He's another year older. We saw what we thought might have been the start of the decline or the acceleration of the decline this year with him. And this is a guy who's coming out of the Sean Payton, hemisphere, where we all know about Sean Payton and not necessarily committing to one running back and hammering away on that guy. It might make me feel a little bit better about Keaton Mitchell and some of those kinds of things, but I'm cautiously optimistic for what this could mean for Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson has the physical tools that we love in a fantasy quarterback. And yeah, if Declan Doyle ends up bringing that kind of play action game to Baltimore, heck yeah, just run the heck out of that. And I would be thrilled for what that can mean for Lamar Jackson. And by extension, then I am cautiously optimistic about the idea of Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers is not a guy that anybody's excited about taking, but Zay Flowers is a guy that just kind of continues to produce. And he is going to be the number one receiver in this offense. Mark Andrews is still around, and Isaiah Likely might still be around and that's great. And we know that Lamar loves to throw to his tight end position, and this is a team that has been big on the tight end position, but coming from the Sean Payton tree, I don't know. We'll see. I like this move for Lamar, and I like this hire for what it might mean for Zay Flowers. Everybody beyond that is up in the air.
Well, a couple things I will say. I don't know if we saw the start of the demise for Derrick Henry when he still went almost 1,600 yards and 16 touchdowns last year. And that's what, to your point of, between Ben Johnson, between Sean Payton, not really featuring one particular running back. Well, Derrick Henry wasn't getting featured all by himself either. They were rotating, whether it be Keaton Mitchell or Justice Hill. Like, the pass catching back was more involved last season than they had been in years past, even though they're Todd Monken. So I think we're still good with Derrick Henry being able to give us, let's say, 1,200 yards and 10 touchdowns.
He's still a threat to the defense.
And that would be very conservative compared to the last few years. And that would alone bode well to the point of the play action play being there. I am with you on the Zay Flowers thing. Now, here's what I want to say. Stop screwing around with Rashad Bateman and DeAndre Hopkins and whatever jamoke schmuck that you want to put out there on the perimeter. Get a legitimate perimeter wide receiver. Because what I could see Declan Doyle doing, if he's able to actually get a legitimate outside receiver, is turn Zay Flowers into a version of what Luther Burden was towards the end of the year, aka more of a yak monster. Zay Flowers was a yak guy coming out of college. He's never been allowed to do that because he's been the number one wide receiver for Baltimore, and they keep putting him in positions where as soon as he gets the ball, he's going to get jumbled and tackled because he's not actually getting the ball in stride, in position to make yards after the catch. It comes a lot easier if you actually have a legitimate perimeter guy who can take the safety out that you have to pay attention to. So I would love to see them do that. If they do that with Doyle's background, I have a very good feeling of what that offense could ultimately look like. But that's something we have to wait and really, really see. Next is the Jets of the West. So the Cardinals go ahead and hire Mike LaFleur and Nathaniel Hackett. You know, the guys who were back-to-back offensive coordinators for years for the Jets. And this is where, as a 49ers fan, I'm very happy. But from a fantasy football standpoint, this is really, really gross. If you thought there was some opportunity for Marvin Harrison to bounce back, for Marvin Harrison and Michael Wilson to be involved with Trey McBride, kiss it goodbye. Remember what I said before about if you're not at least a quarter two offenses, the odds are incredibly slim for you to be able to feed multiple mouths in the receiving room alone. Yeah, well, LaFleur as the play caller for the 21 Jets, guess what? Poor offense, bottom tier quarter four. 2022, a little bit better, quarter three. Not much better. Towards the bottom end of that quarter three tile, too, by the way. Nathaniel Hackett was even worse than that. I didn't even bother putting him in the data because it just gets worse. So and LaFleur, from what I understand, is going to be the play caller here for Arizona, at least early on anyway, regardless. So basically, during that time, the wide receiver one for the Jets in 21, and the wide receiver, it was a little bit better in 2022, but the wide receiver one for the Jets in 21 had a target share of 13%, essentially. Now, a wide receiver one in 2022, they get Garrett Wilson, it goes up to 24%. Okay, we can live with that number, but the point of the matter is, it wasn't anything more than one guy who could actually survive in this offense. And it's not like Arizona's set up to be that much more talented than that Jets offense was, because we don't expect Kyler Murray to hang around. At least that hasn't been the sentiment anyway. They've been wanting to move off of him. So what does that mean? Jacoby Brissett as a quarterback? I know Brissett played well last year, but that was with somebody who was willing to say, hey, the hell with it. Throw the ball 45, 50 times a game. We have no defense anyway. That's not going to be the game plan of these guys coming in, especially not coming into the season. So we could see Jacoby Brissett going back to what he looked like with the Colts or the Browns or, everything before that when we forgot about him and he disappeared for a while, and the reasons being that they were. So the only thing that stayed consistent for LaFleur in his 2 years as the play caller for the Jets was the running back target share. That stayed over league average. That was the only thing that stayed consistent. Nothing else did. Everything was wishy-washy. Everything was still below league average for the most part. He's been with McVay. He's been with Shanahan. Like, he's been around the guys that would give you the strong background to be something. And yet when he's had the opportunity, he was nothing. Now it's the Jets. It was the Jets, Adam. So am I being too hard on LaFleur of not giving him, enough leeway into what he could be away from the Jets? So we know can sink a lot of people.
If you gave him an offensive coordinator that I thought was qualified, I could be convinced. I'm willing to go that far that there is an argument to be made in favor of Mike LaFleur. There are, and I mean this in no uncertain terms, zero arguments in favor of Nathaniel Hackett. Doesn't exist. So if you're going to tell me that Mike LaFleur is aligning with himself and sees something in Nathaniel Hackett, then I can tell you that he has not learned. He did not go back to Sean McVay and learn. It didn't happen. Otherwise I could have been convinced, because I think that Mike LaFleur, for his faults, was kind of given a bad hand with the Jets. He was certainly a better caller than Hackett was. He was better for the job than Hackett was. He and Saleh didn't want to fire him. That call came down from ownership. So I feel for him in a way, but I think, again, with Hackett coming in, it makes it very clear that things aren't going to change and that he is part of the problem. So yeah, I think this is a team where you might see, kind of to your point, a floor with the running backs due to the receiving. But between the two of them, with the Jets, for example, we never saw 1,000-yard rushing season. Like, it's going to be split. These aren't, granted, you may have Breece Hall's second season. If Breece Hall stayed healthy, you probably would have. He was pacing for it. So that one, I'll even throw the asterisk. I'll give you one. But even then, between 4 years, you've got not a whole lot else to look at where I'm like, okay, one guy is going to be fantasy relevant. You're going to split the workload a little bit, and they're not going to be an incredibly efficient run it unit. They'll throw to the ball to the running backs enough that they'll be relevant. Tight end won't be relevant. And, you might be able to force feed a receiver into prominence, but it's probably just because you're going to be down so dang much that
You won't, though. Yep.
It's going to be a game script thing. It's not going to be because schematically they're getting a guy open. It's going to be they have to throw because they're down.
Yeah. So, and this goes back to why I made Trey McBride and Brock Bowers examples at the beginning of the show. I think the vice versa is about to happen with those guys. Clint Kubiak is going to take over the Raiders. We haven't even talked about him yet. We're going to in a minute, but Clint Kubiak is going to take over the Raiders, and then, which he can feed tight ends. We know he's a good play caller in general. And then Trey McBride is going to be on a quarter 3, quarter 4 offense where like his talent alone will make him a weekly tight end starter, but he's not going to be in the upper echelon that we saw after we finally got the lid off the touchdowns. Chase, I want you to focus more in on the wide receivers because people are looking at this like, oh, we think Michael Wilson broke out, or we think Marvin Harrison can still turn this thing around. I almost worried about both of them being on the team as like a bad thing because the one that we did see was like, at least if there's just Garrett Wilson, right? Like, okay, you have no choice to get the ball to Garrett Wilson. If they have choices, like that actually makes me more scared.
No, if you have not sold Marvin Harrison yet in Dynasty, do so before we sign off here. I am not excited about this in any way, shape, or form. First off, as a Packer fan and somebody who has formerly dealt with Nathaniel Hackett, I don't understand how this dude keeps getting jobs at this level in the NFL. If you want to tell me that he keeps getting hired as a quarterback coach or whatever, okay, I mean, maybe, I guess. But how does he keep getting offensive coordinator and higher type positions in this league? You'll never explain that to me. I think LaFleur was an uninspired pick for a head coach position, and I have no confidence in either of the two of them to do anything with what's happening here in the desert. There's talk that Murray will be released or traded, and they're going to go back to hopefully they go back, and at least hopefully from a fantasy standpoint, hopefully they go back to Jacoby Brissett. But with these two guys at the helm of the offense, unfortunately, I love Trey McBride more than just about life itself, but I will not be in on him at all next season. I will not be in at all on their running game because I never know. I don't know what they're going to do or how they're going to use the two of them, regardless of who's healthy. But from a wide receiver standpoint, I already expected Michael Wilson to possibly pull some work away from Marvin Harrison just based on that performance this season. I think Michael Wilson proved that he's a good NFL wide receiver. He was a good fantasy asset when he was the dude, but on the field, on the real field, I think Michael Wilson proved that he has something to offer in the NFL. But does anybody feel comfortable taking either of them, knowing that the very real probability is that the wide receiver work gets split between the two of them in a Mike LaFleur, Nathaniel Hackett type offense? Not me. I don't want anything to do with either one of those guys, unfortunately, and it sucks. I don't know that Marvin Harrison is what we all thought he was anyway. But even if Michael Wilson is what we all kind of jumped on the bandwagon of this season, they're going to have to fight with each other, and they're going to have to fight with the fact that they're on a Nathaniel Hackett, Mike LaFleur type offense for this season. So I'm out across the board in the desert. I don't want anything to do with anything remotely close to Arizona.
It's a LaFleur Hackett offense with a question mark at quarterback. Like, you want to talk about recipes for disaster? There you go. You can't have both. If they didn't have the question at quarterback, then maybe we're going to have a different conversation, but you can't have both those things be true. Okay, so let's talk about Kubiak. He took over the Raiders job, right? Now, he got screwed a little bit with the Saints because of all the injuries that team had. But if you remember the first few weeks, they were catching everybody by surprise. Chris Olave was still a weekly starter besides when he got the concussion injuries. Rashid Shaheed was a weekly wide receiver starter. Kamara was still relevant until, the Kubiak left, even with all the offensive line injuries. And then he goes to Seattle, where he turned JSN into a borderline version of Justin Jefferson, look-alike, essentially. The running back game, like Kenneth Walker nor Zach Charbonnet got going in the way that we were hoping for, but mostly because they were eating into each other. It wasn't because there was a loss of fantasy points for the running back room, right, in general in Seattle. And they didn't have a ton of offensive weapons. So I want to go to you because, we got draft season coming up. The expectation as of now, although I thought some of the comments that Kubiak made recently were interesting, but the expectation as of now is that they're going to take Fernando Mendoza with the number 1 pick. We do know they have Brock Bowers in place. We do know they have Ashton Genty in place. Outside of that, I think everything else is up for grabs. But when you hear Kubiak with Mendoza, potentially Genty, Bowers for sure, what's your overall take?
I think it is so fascinating what quarterback looks like for the Las Vegas Raiders in 2026. And I say that because, one, I hope it's Mendoza. I think Mendoza is going to be a good quarterback in the NFL. I don't know if he's going to be great, but I think he's going to be a good NFL quarterback. But what I will say specifically, I'm emphasizing 2026 here. He does not know, or at least has not performed, because I don't like to negate people for things that they just haven't been asked to do. He has no experience in this type of offense. None. There will not be transferable things for him to lean into. This is an offense that is going to ask him to play under center. That is going to ask him to throw play action, like real play action, not just like the ball is kind of by the running back, but like real play action stuff. Like you're going to run some play action bootlegs. Like it's going to be, it's a real pro style offense to a degree. It not, the collegiate offense that Mendoza had been running. I think that there's going to be a learning curve for him. I think in the long term, he'll be fine. I think you look at guys like Genty. I think it's awesome for Genty. The Seattle ran almost a 50-50 split between zone and gap. Genty can do both. It's going to be awesome because under center, shotgun, zone, gap, they can run at you in any direction that they want, and Genty can be successful. And if they build a strong offensive line, that part of it is going to be awesome. Bowers, Kubiak is a guy who has done a very good job of wherever he's gone adapting. He is one of the guys who does, like we talked about, you should adapt to your personnel. He does. That is like a real, he'll adapt. He figured out how to use Taysom Hill. He's figured out how to use some of the guys in Seattle, where he min-maxed the hell out of that wide receiver room, to be honest with you, because outside of JSN, there was not a lot to work with. And he still managed to have a passing game that was functional, that was one of the top scoring offenses in the NFL. So Clint Kubiak is awesome, but Fernando Mendoza is going to have to take some lumps early on. I think the long term is going to be awesome. I really do. But he's gonna have to take some lumps, and it's where it's a problem is you're like, all right, well maybe you just keep Geno for a year. Geno would be horrific in this offense too. Geno has historically, even when he was good in Seattle, he was bad at play action. He's not this type of quarterback either. So if they want a bridge, they're gonna have to look outside their building right now, or they're just gonna have to let Fernando Mendoza learn on the fly. So it's not something that's going to be an immediate great fantasy offense, but the pieces are there. I think Genty immediately will be good, and the passing game is just going to have to take some time. But I could see by the time you hit fantasy playoffs, and definitely for 2027, this is going to be something where you're reaping the rewards.
I'm with you on that, because I have heard other people turn this into a conspiracy theory of, hey, what if Geno just starts for a year? They don't take Mendoza because maybe they're not sold on the idea that he's a franchise guy, and they wait for 2027, take their quarterback then, trade back. Mendoza goes to the Jets or whatever have you, and they bolster up every other position. ultimately you want to get the quarterback right. Mendoza, to your point, while he doesn't have the instant translatable skills to this system, he does have the intangible skills that translate into this system. Taller quarterback, sees the field well, makes good reads, fairly accurate, can make all the throws, doesn't have necessarily a cannon of an arm, which is right up this Kubiak Shanahan style offense anyway.
Yeah. So long term, I think it's going to be fine.
Right.
But the short, like I said, lumps early.
Yeah, there's the lumps early. And I'm with you. I don't think Geno Smith is a natural fit for this offense either. So that whole bridge thing is not necessarily in my mind. Also, there's a part of me just for Mendoza's sake, I hope the Raiders don't do that to him, because if he does wind up on the Jets, he's absolutely screwed for the rest of his career. So unless he gets a second stunt like, Sam Darnold did. Chase, let me ask you this. Genty, Bowers with Kubiak, where would they be for you?
You took Ashton Genty as a running back 1 last season, and he gave you borderline but pretty solid RB2 on a weekly basis. Brock Bowers, we've seen, we know the talent that's there. We know the kind of player that guy can be. And even though it was a down year for him, he was still a tight end 1. I don't think either, and Bowers, by that same token, only played 12 games for you this year. I mean, if you want to talk on points per game basis, he was a solid top tier level tight end. But I don't think either one of those two guys necessarily is upgraded or downgraded. I'm going to expect the same kind of thing that I saw out of Ashton Genty and out of Brock Bowers this year. I'm going to expect that same kind of thing in 2026 under Clint Kubiak, because we have those questions about what their quarterback position is going to be. They might be going with a rookie in Fernando Mendoza, and that looks likely. But I agree with the points that have been made here about Mendoza's fit in this offense and how long it may take him to ramp up. The biggest questions for me with this offense. So I think that you're going to get a starting caliber running back out of Ashton Genty. I don't know that I want to pay running back 1 price for him in the draft, because I think he's going to be much closer to what he was last year, which was a borderline 12, 13, 14 type running back week in and week out. So do I want to pay solid running back 1 production prices for him, like you're going to have to, I think, next year? No, I don't want to pay that. Brock Bowers. I think Brock Bowers is going to be Brock Bowers, and he's going to be just fine. I have no problem paying the price that I would have to pay to draft Brock Bowers if you are as excited and as hardcore about heavy tight end as yours truly always is. Like, keep in mind, I was the guy that drafted Trey McBride all over the place this season. But until and unless this team can figure out what it's doing at wide receiver and get something more there, I'm not excited about the quarterback position. I'm not excited about the wide receiver position. I think that this head coach hire here bodes much better for the dynasty implications of anybody on your of any Raiders on your roster than it does any 2026 immediate returns for anybody on your roster. So I'm gonna have Genty and I'm gonna have Bowers ranked about where I had them this past season. Everybody else, I'm not gonna even think about until 2027. That's my take on the Raiders rate.
All right, so that wraps up our head coaching changes, right? The guys that had head coaching and offense coordinators. Now we're going to go a little bit more rapid fire as far as the teams that just had an OC change. And I'm going to get one of them out the way right off the rip, and that's Davis Webb. And, Sean Payton had to make a scapegoat for what happened at the end of that game in the playoffs, and also lined it up behind the argument of, like, Davis Webb's is up, and he was getting interview calls, but Davis Webb's is up and coming guy. We had to find a way to keep Davis Webb. Why does it not matter that they promoted Davis Webb to offense coordinator? Because Sean Payton's still going to call Sean Payton plays, and this is still going to be a Sean Payton offense, which ultimately is the most frustrating above average offense, because they have been an above average fantasy football points per game offense every single year since he's taken over 2023, 72.11, 77.29, and 76.29. So they've been in that quarter 2 threshold every single year. And yet, outside of Cortland Sutton being a borderline wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, I don't think any of us feel like we ever know what we're going to get out of any of the pass catchers Tight ends are left out completely ever since Sean Payton doesn't have a Jimmy Graham anymore. Tight ends are not really part of it, and he rotates them like crazy. And the only other thing that's consistent in this offense is that the running backs are going to be heavily targeted compared to the rest of the league as a group. Who that's going to be on a weekly basis, who knows? Because again, he likes to rotate the running back position. We lean a little bit more towards RJ Harvey. Wouldn't be surprised they brought back J.K. Dobbins or brought in somebody else into the mix too. And as a result, Bo Nix is going to be a low in QB1 because they just put enough points together as an offense to which he's going to have a floor as a low in QB1 who can run a little bit. Nothing changes for the Denver Broncos despite the offensive coordinator change. So I just wanted to knock that one right out the way. This one warrants a little bit more of a conversation. So what we're going to do is one at a time. I'll go to Adam here. Chase will get the next one. So Drew Petzing goes to the Detroit Lions from the said Arizona Cardinals. Now, I've never been a Drew Petzing fan. And everyone wants to point to this past season of like, well, he let Jacoby Brissett rip. And actually, for a fantasy standpoint, they were a high-end quarter-2 offense, borderline quarter-1 elite offense from a fantasy football points per game as a team. But again, it's to me, it's circumstantial. The defense was really, really bad. Cardinals decided they had nothing left to lose. They'd go ahead and just let it rip to just try to be competitive and wound up getting the entire coaching staff fired anyway. But we did see Michael Wilson go off. We did see Trey McBride go off. Whoever the running back was at least a fantasy piece to own, whether even when we got down to the Zonovan Knights of the world, people were still plugging and playing them in flex positions. He goes to Detroit. Detroit has all the talent in the world. So you look at Drew Petzing, and you look at his fit in Detroit. He does have some ties there from previously. What's your take here?
I think this is a moderate but not inspiring upgrade over John Morton. It is like you got if you're Dan Campbell and you're going into the locker room talking about 1% better and 1% better, you got 1% better at offensive coordinator. Like, sure, fair enough.
Baby steps.
I think, like I said, moderate improvement. I don't expect a big difference. I think it's worthwhile to note that Petzing in Detroit was running a gap scheme in Detroit's been zone, but Detroit's been fairly mixed. And to be honest with you, with the quality of their offensive line, with the athleticism of their offensive line, and more importantly, with who Jahmyr Gibbs is, I don't care that much. They'll be fine. So like that'd be the one thing that would be cause for alarm, because otherwise, he has familiarity with some of these guys, and in terms of play action and passing concepts, it's not too dissimilar from what they've been doing. So that's like the biggest difference to me, is kind of how they do the run game. And I think you'd have to try really hard to mess up Detroit's run game. So I don't think that it's going to be an issue.
Ultimately,
it could happen.
To Adam's point, ultimately, I think this team is just too talented for it to matter as far as crashing out. Do I think it reaches their ceiling? No, because I will never forget that Drew Petzing is the guy who never figured out how to properly use Marvin Harrison. We all, regardless of what you think of Marvin Harrison as a prospect and whether you think he's a bust or not, we all agree, who actually watched this game on a consistent basis, he was never used how he should have been used to maximize his skill set coming out of college in the first place. We can all agree to that. So as far as utilizing his personnel to the best of his ability, does it give me the utmost confidence? No, absolutely not. Do I think Sam Laporta is going to get left out of the end zone when he has all these other options to go to, and Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams? Yeah, probably. Do I think anybody's role really changes that much? No, I really don't think it does. So I'm kind of with you. Maybe it's a little bit better than Johnny Morton. I had laid out last year where I thought Johnny Morton was a complete and utter failure anyway. And even then, Dan Campbell had to take the play calling away from him because he was a bum. This, from a fantasy standpoint, Detroit offense was still in the elite tier because they're just too good to not be. So ultimately, I'm with you. I'm with you there. Let's talk about the next group, which is Kansas City Chiefs and Eric Bieniemy. And Eric Bieniemy making a return to Kansas City, Chase. Now, when he was with the team as the offensive coordinator, I know it's Andy Reid calling the plays, but with Eric Bieniemy backing him up, that's actually when the Chiefs were at their best. More so than when Matt Nagy was the offensive coordinator and Andy Reid was calling the plays. So in 2018 to 2022, that was the Chiefs' heyday. That's when Bieniemy was the offensive coordinator. And we're talking about 100 fantasy points per game. That's like elite of the elite of the elite. Now, I don't know if Kansas City is in position to get back to that point. We still got to see when Patrick Mahomes is even going to play. But how do you see this return for Bieniemy with this offense? Does Kansas City have a chance to get back to what we've seen? What do they need to do?
I'm going to be dead honest with you. Every question that I had about the Kansas City Chiefs offense going into 2026 before still remains with Eric Bieniemy as the offensive coordinator. We've seen Eric Bieniemy as the offensive coordinator in Kansas City before. We've seen how this thing works, but I wonder, does Patrick Mahomes start the season? Is he ready for the start of the season after his traumatic injury that we saw at the end of this season? Because without that, I mean, it doesn't really matter who's calling the plays. Whoever you have running the quarterback position is a big downgrade from Patrick Mahomes. Secondly, I have no idea who is going to be the RB1 for this team going into next season. I'm not excited about the idea of Isaiah Pacheco. He was never really necessarily a lockdown, start him every week type running back one anyway. He doesn't have a ton of draft capital where this team is going to feel any kind of a need to invest in him and to keep him. He didn't perform all that well after he came back from his injury. Kareem Hunt is 137 years old, 137 years old. And then we have no idea whether Taylor Swift is going to be back in the luxury box or not. And if Taylor Swift is not back in the luxury box, who do they throw to over the middle of the field? Rashee Rice, we have no idea about his legal situations and if he's going to keep his head on straight long enough to actually be on the field. I'm not a Xavier Worthy guy. I'm not willing to invest in Xavier Worthy in any way, shape, or form in fantasy. So, if Taylor Swift doesn't come back in that luxury box, who do they throw to at tight end? If Isaiah Pacheco isn't their running back, who do they bring in? Because whoever they bring in, I mean, I could be persuaded to invest in that guy. I love Rashee Rice as a player. I'm not a big fan of Rashee Rice as a person, and the part of him that's a person is the part of him that's going to affect the part of him that's on the field as a player for me. So I'm never sure about whether I should actually invest in Rashee Rice or not. All the questions that remained with this team, or that were with this team, remain with this team with Eric Bieniemy. I know this can be a successful offense with Eric Bieniemy as their offensive coordinator. I need to know all of those other questions and the answers to all of those before I have any idea how to read this Kansas City Chiefs offense going into 2026.
Yeah, well, we're gonna have to see this. They're gonna adjust that offensive line in particular. It does sound to me like Travis Kelce is gonna play another year, but regardless, the offensive line needs to get addressed, and they got to get explosive at running back to help open up play action back up for Patrick Mahomes for the passing attack to get explosive. They actually had the pieces and pace with Worthy, with Rice, even Kelce, who was still a tight end 6 last year, even though it was clear a decline. If they can get play action pass back invoked into that offense, we might see some big plays again.
Having a pass catching running back like Jerick McKinnon was for them a couple of years ago would go 8,000 miles toward making this such a better offense, but they don't have that guy. Brashard Smith, I like Brashard Smith, but are they going to use him? Are they going to put him in that Jerick McKinnon role? And if they are, who do they complement with him? Because Brashard Smith, I don't think is going to be a 3-down type running back. So again, so many questions with this offense.
But that's the thing. Eric Bieniemy, running backs coach background, you're bringing in, I think, the right guy for the position that you need to address there anyway. I'm going to skip this one because I want to get to Frank Reich because I think that'd be a funnier Colts reaction out of Adam there. As Frank Reich is now the offensive coordinator of the Jets. Why did you bother even firing Tanner Angstrand? Like, what was even the point if you were going to bring Frank Reich in as the offensive coordinator who's been chased out of every job that he's had since being the offensive coordinator of the Eagles that won the Super Bowl? It wasn't all bad with the Colts. Like, he had the first couple of years, did have some strong above average, even one elite offense back there in 2018. But it just progressively got worse and worse and worse till we finally hit the rock bottom point. And then not only hit the rock bottom point with the Colts this last season, but he couldn't even make it through one season with the Carolina Panthers before getting fired, because that looked like a train wreck in and of itself. What we know fantasy wise from Frank Reich, the running backs are going to get fed. We know that the tight end room is going to get fed. We don't know if it's going to be one tight end. Maybe with the Jets it would be. And that the wide receivers are going to be closer to a super spread rather than featuring one particular guy. Although with the Jets, again, personnel-wise, maybe that changes things. But Adam, I got to get your reaction on this.
Yeah, it's a silly one, for sure. It's interesting in the sense that Frank Reich has been good before. It seems like there's a line that you can really clearly draw in the. I actually think it's post Wentz. I think the Wentz year was the last time he was a quality coach in any capacity. I'm not going to clamor for, he had a great coaching season that year. But I think it was all right, especially in hindsight with what the roster was at the time and what Carson Wentz has been since. I think it's pretty clear that he was elevating that team at least to some degree. Since then, however, so the Matt Ryan season, we have the Carolina season. We have last year where he was the interim head coach for Stanford, which was, I'll get that one out of the way, horrific. If you go down to Stanford and you're like barely throwing more touchdowns than interceptions, your run game's a joke, like, that they got the 4-8 is a miracle. And granted, interim situation, he came in like late because of their coach's situation and like a whole bunch of malarkey. But like, you'd think you'd be able to elevate to like some degree, like a former NFL head coach, and it just didn't happen at all. Carolina was horrible, and I think what the big takeaway to me from seeing him fail at some of these other stops is, there are types of quarterbacks where he can work with, like Carson Wentz. I think the big, strong, mobile guy who they complete a good percent, like a good quarterback, he's fine, I guess is what it really boils down to. He tries really hard to hide quarterbacks that are bad. And the way that he hides them is he makes the offense as vanilla as humanly possible. The offense with Bryce Young, for example, was like play action 18% of the time. The A-dot was nothing. Everything, like the underneath was crowded, like no creativity whatsoever. Matt Ryan was honestly very similar. The Jets are not going to have good quarterback play this year. He is not someone you can trust with below average quarterback play. If he went somewhere with a good quarterback, unfortunately, it's a catch-22 because at this point in his career, nobody would trust him with a good quarterback. But I actually think he would be fine. But he cannot hide or elevate below average quarterback play. He is not capable of doing it. He has not ever shown that ability. And I don't think that's changing here. Well, I shouldn't say, well, asterisk, Nick Foles. I'll give him that one. Fair enough. You elevated below average quarterback play one time
for half a season in a year that you're already kind of rolling with Carson Wentz, who was on the way to be the MVP that year.
And was very helped out by a reception by that quarterback, which he was definitely not coaching receptions for that quarterback that season.
I'll give it to him though. The hands up. I was slightly wrong.
For sure. Yep, you put it perfectly. The Jets are not going to have a good quarterback this season, no matter how you break it down, whether it be through the draft or free agency. So
you don't think Malik Willis is a good quarterback?
No, I've already gone through that. But and it would be really stupid for them to even try to sign Malik Willis anyway with where they're at as a franchise.
I agree.
At this point. Look, I'll put it to you this way. Aaron Glenn's not going to be the head coach of the Jets next year, no matter how this kind of thing shakes out. What I'm looking for, Breece Hall, please leave. Maybe Mason Taylor's on my radar. Garrett Wilson, you're going to have a floor as a wide receiver too. I have no hope of you being a wide receiver one. And that kind of sums that up. But here's where I am excited about an offensive play caller hiring. Mike McDaniel going to the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, I know things progressively got worse in Miami, but I think we can all agree, especially when it comes to certain fantasy positions, Mike McDaniel is definitely a plus. He's definitely a plus for the running backs. Was always over the league share in both carries and target share for that position. Devon Achane, very much a dominant RB1. Love this for Amari Hampton, who proved that he can be a 3-down bell cow. We want to get him a little bit more efficient, but also that offensive line without the 2 tackles was completely horrid. So I'm willing to give him a little bit of a pass as far as inefficiencies as a runner. I think Mike McDaniel boosts that room. We also know he will target and feature his wide receiver 1. So Ladd McConkey, welcome to bounce back territory. The one that we don't really actually know, I mean, like he boosted Tua the first year, but ever since then, he's been right at the league average in fantasy points per game for the quarterback position ever since then. But Justin Herbert is definitely an upgrade over Tua Tagovailoa. And even over the last 2 years, we saw Mike McDaniel boost the tight end position, which wasn't a thing his first 2 years. But in the last 2 years, all of a sudden we wanted tight end shares, whether it's Janu Smith or Darren Waller or whoever. Even Greg Dulcich was getting on our dynasty radar because he could boost them. That leads us to Oronde Gadsden. Basically, Mike McDaniel is a multiplier for almost every fantasy football position, and the Chargers have those positions in place as long as the tackles remain. It's basically what it boils down to. So even with his last 2 years being below average, his overall fantasy points per game for the Miami offense was 78.18. The league average was 73.84, and he makes the Q1 overall for his time in Miami. Chase, what's your reaction? What excites you the most about Mike McDaniel?
Hills, yeah. Wheels up for this offense. I like it from the standpoint that I think that Mike McDaniel should and will be smart enough to let Omari and Hampton be the guy in the backfield. I like it from the standpoint of, what, like you said, what it means for Ladd McConkey. I also, if this wide receivers room shakes out like we think it should, I think that Trey Harris should take a jump next season. I think that he can make use out of a guy with the skill set of Oronde Gadsden III. I like that idea. I like all of those ideas. And Tua wasn't great. He was usable at times under McDaniel, but Tua Tagovailoa is not the quarterback. He's not the pure passer and the pure distributor of the football and the pure just overall quarterback one that Justin Herbert is. I like the idea of pairing Mike McDaniel with an actual quarterback one, which is what I believe Justin Herbert is from a skill set standpoint. So I like this move all around. I think it's going to be fun. I think that, Mike McDaniel is going to spend much more time on game planning and scheming, being the offensive coordinator, and much less time trying to script out what he's going to say to entertain us all in those post-game interviews. I'm thrilled about the whole idea. I think this could be a very big hire, and I think it's an offense that I want to invest in going into 2026 at this point.
The biggest knock from Mike McDaniel was that he ran an offense that was too finesse. That's not going to be an issue with a Jim Harbaugh-led team.
Right. And
they have the skill position talent of which to make Mike McDaniel's offense very, very successful. It is a win all the way around. What I don't know if is a win all the way around is the Philadelphia Eagles getting stuck with Sean Mannion as the offensive coordinator after they pretty much tried to go through everybody else and landed on another guy who has not called plays before. Coming from the background of the Packers, was the quarterback's coach there. Now, what I do find interesting about this, Adam, is that the way the Packers hide Jordan Love, deep ball thrower, try not to have him throw the ball too many times per game, otherwise he gets overexposed. That is a recipe that I do think you want to follow for Jalen Hurts. But I don't know how I feel about a first-time play caller being the offensive coordinator of the Eagles, because that means to me Nick Sirianni may have more say over said offense, and that's been the issue since he's been the head coach of the Eagles. So what's your breakdown with Sean Mannion?
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head there. If they let him fully implement the Packers offense, I think that would bode well for the Philadelphia Eagles. I don't think that happens with a first-year guy because, to your point, Sirianni can just walk all over you. I think that the other thing that concerns me here is that there's two prongs to what Philadelphia needs to do to get back on track. We just talked about one of them, and that's to get a competent Jalen Hurts, a competent passing game going. The second prong of it is they really, really, really need to fix this run game. And they will now lay it out after a long, long time under the same offensive line coach. That's gone. They will be switching from they'll be going from being a gap team to a zone team. And granted, both Green Bay and Philadelphia were fairly multiple, but they are switching what they do the majority of the time. And Green Bay's rushing offense, good, but it just nothing about Sean Mannion screams he's going to solve their problems, which are real problems in the running game. I don't think we're at a point where we can just shoulder wave Barkley is going to just turn it around. He'll be fine because of the volume he had the year prior. He's going to revert back to what he was. With a good coaching solve, maybe, sure. But there are real offensive line problems, and they need to get an identity again. If in full control, Sean Mannion could fix this offense. But if he has Sirianni meddling while he has to solve these very real problems, he's not going to succeed.
Yep. That's pretty much how I see it too. The offensive line is the big key. You have, is Dickerson who's talking about retirement? Lane Johnson can't stay healthy anymore. This offensive line, one of the big reasons the offense crumbled outside of Kevin Patullo's, ridiculous play calling was that they're old. They're broken down. They don't have replacements coming up behind them to take over. I mean, we can say it was Saquon and his over 400 touches the year before, and that could be a real possibility. That's been history. But we could also point to the fact that, Saquon stayed healthy. He looked explosive when he actually got in space. It was more of he never really got the space very often because the offensive line wasn't very good. So there's just going to be a lot of unknowns with the Philadelphia Eagles. There's still talk about, do they trade A.J. Brown to see force his way out? I still don't think that winds up happening. I think we're going to have the same skill players that we've had the past couple of years. But what does that turn into? This is going to be one that, frankly, we don't have a data sample size to know for sure, other than he's going to have his preferences like you laid out from the Packers in the zone scheme, and that he will likely follow suit of not trying to overexpose Hurts by having him throw a bunch, which ultimately are good things, I think, for this team, but they got to get some of the stuff ironed out. All right, let's talk a little Zach Robinson, who was the Atlanta Falcons offensive coordinator. He goes now to Tampa Bay, stays in division because, why not? They got to see him the most, so they obviously got to see something up close that the rest of us didn't, because none of us really liked how inconsistent. I won't say inept. It wasn't totally inept because it was still a quarter two offense or a quarter three offense. So it was a higher on the below average scale, but inconsistent to say the least. Predictable, to Adam's point earlier, with the Atlanta Falcons offense. So Zach Robinson comes in. They averaged, 76.6 fantasy points per game. The Atlanta Falcons did. That was enough to be on the low end quarter two. Last year was a quarter three type of offense, but we did see a wide receiver one and Drake London get the ball. We did see an elite running back be able to get the ball. Kyle Pitts even came back in a surgeons last season, and Tampa Bay has a ton of weapons. We don't know if Mike Evans will be back, but Chris Godwin will be there. They have Ibuka. They have Bucky Irving. You have a nice tight end in Cade Otton. They have Jalen McMillan, so they're still going to have probably three receivers. There's still going to be talent here. So how do you take away from this, Chase?
This is still an offense that I want to buy into. I am curious to see, like you just mentioned, how the off-season shakes out. Does Mike Evans come back? If Mike Evans come back, I have no problem drafting him at the right price, but I really do like the idea of Baker Mayfield in this offense, still having all of those weapons at his disposal. I think this is still an offense that will run through him. I do like what it means for whatever running backs remain in Tampa Bay if all three of Bucky Irving and Sean Tucker and Rashad White come back. I still think they all can be usable pieces, and I tend to think it's going to be two of those three. I don't think this is I don't see this as a downgrade at all for this offense moving to Zach Robinson, because I like what he was able to do with who he had in Atlanta. And I think he's going to have more consistent quarterback play out of Baker Mayfield in Tampa Bay. So I'm still willing to invest in this offense. I'm still willing to invest across the board in this offense, especially after I see how this offseason shakes out regarding who is left, what running backs are left, what wide receivers are left. I'm in on those guys for 2026.
I think the point with Zach Robinson is that we know the volume will go to the main guys.
Yes.
So ultimately, for fantasy purposes, we're okay with that. And I kind of said this earlier in the show, where I kind of question is he's another one of those guys where you give him too many options, does it just wind up being inconsistent? That's kind of what happened in Atlanta. You focus on the big guys. If you couldn't get it to them, nothing else he could do with the offense outside of that. Very similar situation. But I think with Tampa Bay, if their offensive line is healthy, that was a big issue for them last year. You circle in on Ibuka, you circle in on Godwin, you circle in on Bucky. The rest of it will probably be made to go. Again, it'll be competent. I don't think this has a chance to be an elite offense, though.
I think the talent level person for person on Tampa Bay compares favorably to what Zach Robinson had to work with in Atlanta. Bijan Robinson is the best skill position player of anybody on either team, and I won't debate that. But once you get past him, I think that the skill position talent in Tampa Bay compares very favorably to what he had in Atlanta. So I'm willing to buy in on those guys, knowing what we got out of what he had to work with in Atlanta.
I agree with that. Last but not least, to close up the show, is David Blau, the new offensive coordinator for the Washington Commanders after being the quarterback's coach, because apparently Adam Peters and Kingsbury weren't seeing eye to eye. Rare to hear the GM and the offensive coordinator come down on each other, but that's what we had going on in Washington here. So they move on with Kingsbury. They promote David Blau from within. So I could give you all the numbers, but they're basically the Kingsbury numbers of the play callers from the last 2 years. The only thing I've heard that they're expecting to change, Dan Quinn came out the other day and said, I expect Jaden Daniels to play more under center within this new offense. I don't think that's a freaking good thing for a guy who doesn't read defenses very well. The whole point of the shotgun is to get a little extra time to see what happens post-snap, which usually helps well for a guy who doesn't make great pre-snap reads. And that's been Jaden Daniels' knock since LSU. So now we're going to make him, that tells me they want him to be more in control of the offense. Didn't play a whole lot last year to take the next step up in that regard and make quicker decisions. Or put it this way, read the field more. Where before, Kingsbury was pretty much laying it out for him. The reason why the ball got out of his hands so quickly is because Kingsbury was making it clear, you're going here or you're going there. That's it. You're not doing anything else. So this tells me there's going to be a change from that. I don't know if that's a good thing. Adam, what's your take here?
I think it's interesting. To me, what that signifies is, to be candid, is that they want to turn Jaden Daniels as a passer into what Lamar Jackson has become. They have shown that Cliff has done a lot more play action than he had in previous stops with Jaden Daniels. I think that is a sign that they want to move in that direction. And I think that going under center would be more of that. Now, we have seen that at times Lamar Jackson has been in some very disappointing offenses, so that there's certainly some interest there, and if that is the right call, for one. And then for two, that seems to be very, there's one similar quarterback in the NFL from like a height, weight, speed profile. Let's just copy what they do with him, and hopefully it works. So it seems like, because I agree, I don't think that's what is best for Jaden Daniels. And what it certainly is, because I could be wrong there. Long term, I could be wrong. But what I know to be true is short term that I'm not wrong. Short term, it's very similar to a Fernando Mendoza in that if you try to put Jaden Daniels in that type of system immediately, then immediately there will be growing pains. Now, maybe he develops, maybe he doesn't. And maybe that's what the front office was thinking, is that they want long term would like Jaden Daniels to be their franchise quarterback. And as such, They need him to develop as a passer who can read defenses once his legs leave. And they saw that Cliff, and this is correct, and I will give them this, Cliff was not going to develop those skills. He was not going to make him a better quarterback long term. I think that Jaden Daniels is probably a quarterback where you ride out his athleticism and you hide the flaws while you can. But if they see it differently, then I can see how they come to that conclusion. Ultimately, I don't have very high hopes for this Washington offense. I can kind of see where they're coming from, but it seems like there's just going to be maybe the way that they do it will be a different way. It'll look a little bit different on the field, but I think ultimately what you saw last year in terms of their offensive production is probably pretty close to what you're going to see this year.
Yeah, it's coming from the same place. I mean, like, are you hoping he brings in Sean McVay styles from when he was a quarterback? Like that, I think that's the other thing that annoyed me about this coaching carousel. Is like if you like breathe the same air at any point as McVay or Kyle Shanahan, you essentially got a job no matter where he came from. But so I'm with you entirely. This is definitely not going to be a boost. I can't say it's definitely a negative because, again, we just don't have enough of a sample size here either way, other than I don't like the idea of Jaden Daniels playing under center more often. I don't think that's a great fit. And my problem with Jaden Daniels ultimately is injury proneness. Just how skinny he is. He needs to bulk up. But more so than that, this is another coaching staff like the Jets that I think could be cleared out next season. Because, again, this is a team that's still one of the oldest teams in the league, no matter how you break it down. And like I said years ago, Dan Quinn gets worse with time, not better. So,
putting Jaden Daniels under center wastes his athleticism, which is his greatest asset.
Correct. Because Jaden Daniels' athleticism, where it's different than Lamar's, he's got the long speed. But he doesn't have the quick twitch of Lamar, which is why Lamar can get, and even in Lamar's case, they still want him playing in pistol as his version of under center more times than not. But he can get under center and still kind of roll that offense, how quick twitched he is. It's not really how Jaden Daniels' athleticism works. A little bit more long speed in that sense. We'll see how it all breaks down. Jam-packed episode. I know, big 2-hour episode. Not something we generally do, but we had a lot we wanted to get through, and we wanted to come back to those coaching changes because next week it's going to be time to start talking about leading into the combine because that is right around the corner. Gotta love the NFL giving me action all year long. Make sure you download Operation Domination on your favorite podcast app and check out our video content when you go to the Fantasy Football Advice Network YouTube channel. Dan, Adam, Chase, guys, we'll see you all next time.